In the 19th century, a few nations just went out and took over huge chunks of the world, building these massive empires. But have you ever stopped to wonder how they actually justified it? How did they sell this idea, not just to the people they were conquering, but to their own citizens back home? Well, as we're about to see, it wasn't just about ships and guns. It was about having a really powerful set of ideas. So that's the big question we're tackling. How did these powerful industrial nations convince themselves that taking over millions of people was not only okay, but that it was actually a noble, righteous thing to do? The answer, as you might guess, is a lot more complex than you think. See, the justifications they used weren't just random excuses made up on the spot. They actually formed a really consistent and repeatable set of arguments, almost like a playbook for building an empire. And nations from Britain to Japan are all reading from it. This playbook really had 3 core chapters, and we're going to walk through them. First, you get everyone fired up with national pride. That creates the desire for an empire. Second, you claim the moral high ground to give yourself the perfect excuse. And third, you make sure it's profitable, because that provides the fuel for the whole operation. Okay, let's start with the first and maybe the most powerful ingredient: pride. The 19th century was just consumed by this new idea called nationalism. And it was this potent force that made conquering territory feel like a grand national mission. Now, when we say nationalism, we're not just talking about loving your country. This was different. This was a belief in your nation's superiority. It turned global politics into this fierce competition, and having a sprawling empire became the ultimate trophy. It was the #1 way to prove your nation was the greatest. And you can see this nationalism playing out all over the map. For Britain, expanding into places like Australia and India was all about grabbing resources and projecting pure power. For France, on the other hand, it was about healing a wounded ego. After getting crushed in the Franco-Prussian War, colonizing parts of Africa and Southeast Asia was their way of getting their glory back. And then you have Japan, which burst onto the scene after modernizing and immediately started building its own empire to prove it could hang with the big European powers. So you've got this intense pride driving you forward. But raw ambition on its own isn't a great look. You need a better story, a noble-sounding purpose to mask what you're really doing. And that's where the so-called civilizing mission comes in. This is where you see this massive contradiction at the heart of the whole thing. The public story, the benevolent claim, was all about bringing progress, modern medicine, education, you name it, to what they called inferior cultures. But underneath that shiny surface was a foundation of deeply racist beliefs, often propped up by pseudoscience arguing that Europeans were just inherently superior. And one of the most powerful tools they used was social Darwinism. Now, this was a complete twisting of Charles Darwin's actual scientific work. It took survival of the fittest and turned it into a political weapon. It basically argued that it was natural for superior nations to dominate weaker ones. In an age that was obsessed with science, this made conquest seem less like an act of aggression and more like an unavoidable law of nature. And if you want a really wild example of this kind of pseudoscience, look no further than phrenology. Yeah, the so-called study of skull sizes. This totally debunked practice was actually used as scientific proof to create a hierarchy of races. It was treated as legit science at the time, offering what they saw as hard data to justify colonial rule. Now, the role of religious missionaries just adds another fascinating layer to all this. A lot of them were true believers in this civilizing mission. They set up schools, they brought modern medicine. You had figures like David Livingstone who genuinely fought to end the illegal slave trade. But even with all the good they might have done, their work was still tangled up in this larger project of colonial control, reinforcing that idea of cultural superiority. Okay, so we've got the pride and we've got the progress. But none of this happens for free. What paid for it all? Well, that brings us to the final and maybe the most critical piece of the playbook: profit. The engine of industry needed fuel, and colonies were the ultimate gas station. The connection here is really direct. The Industrial Revolution was absolutely ravenous for raw materials. We're talking cotton, rubber, metals, all of it. And once the factories turned those materials into finished goods, they needed new places to sell them. Well, guess what? Colonies solved both problems beautifully. And what's crazy is that often it wasn't even governments leading the charge. It was these massive corporations. I mean, the British East India Company in India and the Dutch VOC in Indonesia were basically private companies that ran their own armies and governed huge territories, all to lock down monopolies on things like spices and textiles. This quote about the opium trade just lays it all bare.
It really shows how ruthless this economic logic could be. The British weren't just selling illegal opium to China because it was profitable. Those profits were a cornerstone of their entire industrial economy back home. It was a clear case where profit steamrolled any pretense of having a civilizing mission.
Okay, so let's pull all three of these threads back together. We've got the pride, the so-called progress, and the profit. Let's see how they combined to create such a rock-solid justification for empire. So here's the imperial logic in a nutshell. Nationalism gave them the motive, the why they should do it. The idea of a civilizing mission, backed up by all that racist pseudoscience, gave them the moral cover, the how it's okay to do it. And finally, the incredible profits from trade gave them the means, the how it's possible to do it. Each part just made the others stronger, creating this almost unbreakable rationale for taking over the world. And all of this leaves us with one final thought. I mean, these justifications can feel like ancient history, right? But the core ideas behind them, appeals to national greatness, claims of cultural superiority, the powerful pull of economic interests, they haven't really gone away. So the big question for us is, how do these 19th century rationales for power continue to echo in our world today?